All right, welcome back, fellow philosophy enthusiasts. Today we're diving into one of those figures that you can't avoid in philosophy.
Yeah, inescapable, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's Socrates.
Right?
And the fun part about Socrates is that he never wrote anything down.
That's right. And yet his impact is just enormous.
Huge.
Mm.
Absolutely massive. I mean, think about that. Like how influential can you be? How important can your ideas be if you don't write them down? Well, apparently so influential that we're still talking about you thousands of years later.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And it also creates this really fascinating problem, right? Because if we don't have Socrates on words, how do we know what he actually thought?
Yeah, we have to go to his students, I guess, would be the best.
Associates.
Yeah, yeah.
People who knew him.
People who knew him and wrote about him.
Yeah.
And kind of the big three there are Aristophanes.
Playwright.
Yeah. Then we got Xenophon, the historian.
Who was also a soldier.
A soldier, yeah. And of course the big one, Plato.
Yes. The philosopher.
The philosophers, the student.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. They all give us slightly different versions of Socrates.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so tricky, right? So not only do we have this problem of like, well, we don't have his own words, then we have to go to these other sources, but then they give us all these different pictures of who Socrates was, what he thought, how he acted. So it becomes this big puzzle to try to piece together, well, who was this guy?
So that leads to the big, what's called the Socratic problem, which is how do we know what the real Socrates was like?
That's right.
So that's what we're gonna try to dive into today. Try to figure out who was Socrates, and more importantly, how do we even go about answering that question?
Yep.
What kind of tools do we have available to us as philosophers to even begin to try to figure that out?
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point, right? Because I think as philosophers, we're always, I think, naturally curious about history, about where these ideas come from. But I think we also have to be aware of the fact that history is messy, that it's not always clear-cut, that the sources aren't always reliable, and that we have to be really careful about how we interpret them.
Absolutely. And so that's what makes Socrates such an interesting case study, I think, because he embodies all of those difficulties.
Yes, he does.
But before we get too deep into that, why don't we start by kind of painting a picture for the listener of what Socrates was like? Like, what did this guy look like?
So the first thing that's really interesting about Socrates is that he was kind of strange looking.
Yeah.
Not what you would expect from the great, like, philosophical mind.
Right. No, not the classic Greek statues that we see of perfectly proportioned men and so forth.
Yeah, he was kind of the opposite of that.
Yeah, so people described him as having these wide-set, bulging eyes.
Kind of like a crab, some people said.
A crab, yeah. Upturned nose, thick lips.
Long hair.
Long hair.
Often unwashed, barefoot.
And it wasn't just his physical appearance, right? It was also his personality.
Yeah, so he was known for having this swagger.
Kind of an intimidating presence.
Yeah, some people found it kind of off-putting.
Yeah.
But he was also known for being incredibly resilient, right? Like he could withstand the cold better than anyone.
Yeah.
He could drink everyone under the table, apparently.
Yeah.
So he had this kind of physical hardiness that was unusual.
So physically he's a little strange. He's a little bit different. He's not what we're expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And this strangeness extends to his, I guess, how he lives his life.
Yeah, his values.
Yeah.
The things that he cared about were different from most Athenians.
Right. So in Athens, people were striving for wealth. They were striving for power. They were striving for political influence. And Socrates doesn't seem to care about any of that.
Right. He was notoriously indifferent to material wealth. He didn't care about fancy clothes. He didn't care about a big house. He didn't care about having a lot of money.
He didn't even really want to be involved in politics.
Yeah, he was very skeptical of the Athenian political system.
But yet he still had all these young men who followed him around, wanting to learn from him.
Yeah, and this is another one of those kind of paradoxes about Socrates, right? He claims he's not a teacher. He says, I don't know anything.
Yeah. I have nothing to teach you.
I'm just a philosopher. I'm just a lover of wisdom. But yet he has this huge following of people who are clearly learning from him.
And so this brings us to his method, right? Like, what was it about Socrates and the way that he interacted with people that was so different and that people found so compelling?
So his method was primarily what we call the Socratic method.
Yeah.
Which is essentially a method of questioning.
Yeah.
So he would go up to people and he would ask them questions about things that they thought they knew about.
Right.
And through his questioning, he would kind of expose the holes in their knowledge.
Yeah, and this wasn't like a mean-spirited kind of like gotcha.
Right.
This wasn't, trying to make people feel bad.
No, it was more like he genuinely believed that the way to get at the truth was to question your assumptions, to examine your beliefs, to really think critically about the things that you thought you knew.
Yeah. And so he would ask these questions in such a way that it would lead people to kind of discover the truth for themselves.
Yeah, and he had this great analogy of the midwife.
Right.
So he would say, "I'm like a midwife, but for ideas."
Yeah.
So just like a midwife helps a woman give birth to a child, Socrates would help people give birth to their own idea.
But let's be honest, giving birth is not always the most comfortable process.
No, it's not.
And so I imagine that being on the receiving end of the Socratic method wasn't always the most pleasant experience either.
No, it could be quite painful.
Yeah, so he would confuse people, he would challenge people, he would even sting people with his words.
And he would make them feel, I think, a certain degree of shame,
Yeah.
right? Shame in the sense of, wow, I thought I knew this. I thought I had this figured out, and now I realize that I don't.
Yeah. And so there's this other aspect of him too that I think is quite fascinating. And that's his view of women.
Right.
And this is particularly interesting given the time period.
Yeah, because in ancient Athens, women were very much second-class citizens.
Yeah.
They were not allowed to participate in public life.
Yeah, they were very much confined to the home.
Yeah.
And yet Socrates seems to have had a very different view.
Yeah, he actually had a lot of respect for women,
Yeah,
and he even claimed to have learned from women.
that's right. I mean, he specifically says, I learned rhetoric from Aspasia.
Who was a brilliant woman, a foreigner living in Athens.
Yeah, not even an Athenian citizen.
Right. And he also claimed to have learned about love, about eros from a woman named Diotima.
Yeah, and this is quite remarkable, right? That he's
Yeah.
willing to acknowledge these women as his intellectual superiors in some ways.
And it just goes to show how different he was from most of his contemporaries.
Yeah, he's not afraid to challenge the norms, the conventions of his time.
Absolutely. And it's also important to note that, his relationship with women was not just intellectual.
Right.
He was also known to be quite charming and charismatic, and he had a lot of female admirers.
But now, of course, we have to talk about this.
Yeah.
His relationships with young men.
Right. And this is something that's been the subject of much debate and controversy over the centuries.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, we know that in ancient Athens, it was not uncommon for older men to have relationships with younger men that were both intellectual and physical.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we also have these sources that claim that Socrates, while he was attracted to young men, he never actually engaged in any kind of physical relationship with them.
Yeah.
That his relationships with them were purely intellectual and focused on their moral improvement.
Yep.
So it's hard to know for sure what the truth is here, but I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity of the issue and to avoid making any kind of hasty judgments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't impose our own modern sensibilities on the past.
Right.
And so we have to try to understand these relationships within the context of the time and the culture in which they took place.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that, Socrates is not a god.
Right.
He's a human being.
Yeah.
And so he's going to have his flaws. He's going to have his contradictions.
Absolutely.
And I think that's part of what makes him so fascinating.
Yeah, it's part of what makes him human.
Yeah.
So we've got this strange, unconventional, really intriguing figure in Socrates. Now let's get back to this Socratic problem, right? Like how do we make sense of all these different sources? How do we know which Socrates to believe?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to realize is that we're probably never going to be able to fully resolve this problem.
Right.
Because we just don't have enough evidence.
Yeah, we're always going to be dealing with these partial fragmentary accounts.
Yeah. And so I think the best we can do is to try to be as critical and as nuanced as possible in our reading of the sources.
Yeah, and to be aware of the biases and the agendas of the people who are writing about Socrates.
Absolutely. So let's start with Aristophanes.
Yeah.
So Aristophanes, as you mentioned earlier, was a playwright.
Yeah.
He was a comedian.
Right.
And so his primary goal was to entertain.
Yeah.
And he did that by satirizing the people and the institutions of his day.
Yeah.
And so in his play Clouds, he portrays Socrates as this kind of ridiculous figure.
Yeah.
He's the head of a school called the Thinkery, where he teaches young men all sorts of absurd things, like how to measure the the distance of flea jumps.
Yeah, and how to make the weaker argument appear the stronger,
Right.
which was a real concern for people at the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sophists, who were these traveling teachers of rhetoric, were very controversial in ancient Athens.
Yeah, and they had a reputation for being able to twist words and to make bad arguments seem good.
Yeah, and so Aristophanes is kind of playing on that fear,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
Socrates is this kind of sophist figure who's corrupting the youth.
Yeah, he's teaching them how to be dishonest.
Yeah, he's teaching them how to disrespect their
Yeah,
parents.
and he's even accused of being impious.
Yeah, of not believing in the gods.
Right. So it's a pretty unflattering portrait.
Yeah, it is.
Now, how much of that do we take seriously?
Right. Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, Aristophanes was a contemporary of Socrates, so
Mhm.
he knew him.
Yeah.
He saw him around Athens.
Yeah.
And so there's probably some truth to his portrayal, right?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine Socrates probably was a bit of an eccentric.
Yeah.
Probably did have some unusual ideas.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we have to remember that this is a comedy.
Right.
And so Aristophanes is exaggerating for comedic effect.
Yeah, he's not trying to give us an accurate historical account of Socrates.
Right. He's trying to make us laugh.
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful about taking everything he says literally.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to remember that, Socrates himself was aware of Aristophanes' play,
Right.
and he actually addresses it in his own defense speech at his trial.
Yeah, he says that Aristophanes' portrayal of him was actually more damaging than the accusations of his actual accusers.
Yeah, because it kind of poisoned the minds of the jury against him.
Yeah, it created this image of him as this dangerous, subversive figure
Yeah.
that was hard to shake.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting to think about, right? Because like what does it say about the power of satire?
Yeah.
The power of comedy to actually shape public opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that we still see today.
Yeah.
Comedians have a lot of power to influence people's views.
Yeah. And it's something that we should be aware of as consumers of comedy and satire.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's Aristophanes. So a bit of a distorted view, perhaps,
Yeah,
but maybe some truth in there somewhere.
maybe, yeah.
Okay, so now let's move on to Xenophon.
Okay, so Xenophon, as we said, was a soldier, a historian,
Right?
and he was also a friend of Socrates.
Yeah, he was actually a student of Socrates for a time.
Yeah. And so in his writings, he presents a very different picture of Socrates than Aristophanes does.
Yeah, his Socrates is much more practical.
Yeah. Down to earth,
Yeah,
sensible.
yeah,
He's not this kind of otherworldly, abstract thinker that Aristophanes makes him out to be.
right. And he actually gives advice on things like how to run a household.
Yeah.
How to manage your money.
Yeah, military strategy.
Yeah, things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being, the domain of a philosopher.
Yeah.
But this is Xenophon's Socrates.
Yeah.
So is this a more accurate portrayal?
Well, it's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, Xenophon was certainly closer to Socrates than Aristophanes was,
Right.
and he had a different agenda.
Yeah.
He wasn't trying to make fun of Socrates.
Right. He was trying to portray him in a positive light.
Yeah. And to present him as a model of virtue and wisdom.
Yeah. But I think we also have to be careful here, right?
Yeah.
Because Xenophon is writing about Socrates many years after Socrates' death.
Yeah, so his memories might be a little bit hazy.
Yeah, and he might be shaping the story to fit his own purposes.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that Xenophon himself was a very practical man.
Yeah.
So it's natural that he would focus on the more practical aspects of Socrates' teachings.
Yeah, he's kind of seeing Socrates through his own lens.
Yeah.
Which is gonna color his portrayal.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the comic Socrates, we've got the practical Socrates. Now we come to the philosopher Socrates, Plato's Socrates.
Right. So Plato is the most important source for us.
Yeah.
Because he's the one who really gives us the philosophical Socrates.
Yeah, this is the Socrates that we think of when we think of Socrates, the philosopher.
Yeah. The one who's engaged in these deep philosophical dialogues about the nature of justice, the nature of beauty, the nature of truth.
Yeah.
And so Plato's dialogues are really our best source for understanding Socrates' philosophy.
Yeah. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Plato is also a philosopher,
Right.
and he's a brilliant philosopher.
Yeah, one of the greatest philosophers of all time.
Right. So how much of what we see in the dialogues is Socrates, and how much of it is Plato?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. But I think it's safe to say that Plato is using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas,
Right.
at least to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that Socrates could have come up with all of the ideas that are attributed to him in the dialogues.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to remember that, Plato was writing these dialogues many years after Socrates' death.
Right.
And so he's had time to reflect on Socrates' teachings and to develop his own philosophical views.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth pointing out that Plato's dialogues are works of literature.
Yeah.
They're not just philosophical treatises.
Right.
They're stories.
Yeah.
They're dramas.
Yeah.
And so Plato is using all of the tools of the storyteller to create these compelling and engaging dialogues.
Yeah. And so we have to be aware of that when we're reading them.
Yeah, we can't just take everything at face value.
Right.
We have to be aware of the literary devices that Plato is using.
Yeah. And I think, one of the biggest challenges for scholars of Plato is to try to distinguish between what's Socratic and what's Platonic in the dialogues.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer to that question.
Yeah.
But I think, one way to approach it is to look at the development of Plato's thought over time.
Yeah, and so there's this theory called developmentalism,
Right.
which tries to track the evolution of Plato's thought by looking at the chronological order of his dialogues.
Yeah. And so the basic idea is that the early dialogues are more Socratic.
Yeah.
And then as Plato gets older, his own views start to come through more and more.
Right.
And so by the time we get to the later dialogues, it's really more Plato than Socrates.
Yeah.
But even that's a controversial thing.
Yeah, because there's no consensus on the chronological order of the dialogues.
Right.
And so it's hard to say for sure which ones are early and which ones are late. But even if we could say for sure, this is an early dialogue, this is a late dialogue, it's still hard to know where Socrates ends and Plato begins.
Right, because even in the early dialogues, there's still Plato's influence.
Yeah.
He's still shaping the dialogue.
Right, he's still choosing what to include and what to leave out.
Yeah.
And so we're always going to be dealing with this problem of interpretation.
Yeah.
We're never going to be able to get a completely objective view of Socrates.
Right.
Because we're always going to be seeing him through the lens of someone else's perspective.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, like, what do we do with that?
Right.
What do we do with this realization that we can't really know for sure who Socrates was?
Well, I think one thing we can do is to just embrace the ambiguity.
Yeah.
To accept the fact that we're never going to have all the answers.
Yeah.
And to just enjoy the process of exploring these different interpretations of Socrates.
Yeah. And to see what we can learn from each of them.
Yeah. Because I think, even though we can't know for sure who Socrates was, I think we can still learn a lot from the different ways that he's been portrayed.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I mean, I think Aristophanes teaches us about the dangers of unchecked intellectualism and
Yeah.
the importance of tradition and social norms.
Yeah.
And I think Xenophon teaches us about the practical value of philosophy and the importance of living a virtuous life.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Plato teaches us about the power of reason and the search for truth.
Yeah, and the importance of questioning everything.
Yeah. So I think, even though we can't know for sure who Socrates was, I think we can still learn a lot from the different ways that he's been portrayed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the Socratic problem isn't just a problem for historians of philosophy. It's a problem for anyone who's interested in understanding the nature of truth and knowledge.
Yeah.
Because it raises these really fundamental questions about how we know what we know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And about the reliability of our sources of information.
Yeah.
And so I think, as philosophers, we have to be aware of these problems.
Yeah.
And we have to be careful about how we approach the study of history and the study of the great thinkers of the past.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as philosophers is to be humble.
Yeah.
To recognize the limits of our own knowledge and to be open to the the possibility that we might be wrong.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really what Socrates was all about.
Yeah.
He was all about questioning everything
Yeah.
and not taking anything for granted.
Yeah, and so I think that's a great lesson for us to take away from this deep dive into Socrates.
Yep.
That even though we can't know for sure who he was, we can still learn a lot from him.
Yeah. And we can still be inspired by his example
Yeah.
to live a life of questioning and searching for truth.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. And I think we'll leave the listener with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
And that is, if we can't know for sure who Socrates was, what does that say about the nature of history itself?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
And I think it's a question that all historians have to grapple with.
Yeah.
You know, how do we know what happened in the past, and how do we make sense of it?
Yeah, and how do we avoid imposing our own biases and our own agendas on the past?
Yeah.
So I think that's something for the listener to think about.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll come back to that question in a future episode.
Yeah, that would be great.
But for now, we'll leave it there. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.